Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real privilege. So my talk is about keeping customers satisfied, and that's a particularly challenging task because there's no such thing as an average customer. If we want to understand more about people's demands and desires around poultry production, we need to think about consumers, but also non-consumers, people who have opted out of eating poultry products for one reason or another. And we need to recognise that people are individuals with their own complicated backgrounds and reasons for making their eating decisions. Given this, we might expect a huge diversity of opinion about chicken welfare. But in Europe, at least, there's remarkable consistency. Large-scale Eurobarometer surveys have been conducted in many years, looking at samples of 30,000 people to ask about their views on farm animal welfare. And in Europe, nearly all respondents think that farm animals should be better protected. For example, in 2006, 36% thought farm animal welfare was of the highest possible importance. And 10 years later, by 2016, that had increased to 57%. But there was also general agreement in both surveys that of all farmed animal species, chickens experienced the worst welfare and were the most in need of further protection. So it's safe to say that Europeans are far more united on chicken welfare than on any other issue. But if we go a little bit deeper into these results, it's interesting to note that concern for chicken welfare in Europe is not affected by rural living or urban living or political views. There's a minor influence of gender, with women being a little bit more concerned, but the most important factor associated with a concern for chicken welfare is education level. The other surprising finding is that people with slightly lower household incomes, and certainly younger people, express far more concern than older and wealthier demographics. So surveys of this kind provide a snapshot, but we need more detailed studies to understand what people mean when they say they want higher welfare products. Analyses show that people are mostly concerned about industrialized agricultural systems. They're concerned about animals being treated as products rather than sentient creatures, and they're concerned that animals are unable to live natural lives. It's also interesting to note that people weigh inherent features of agricultural systems much more highly than risks. So, for example, a conventional cage confines every single chicken in a small space allowance, and it doesn't matter how good the husbandry is, nothing can alter that fact. It's inherent to the system. And for many people, such cages are seen as prisons. I'm not over-exaggerating, these are the terms that people use. And then when people are told that the disease risks can be higher in alternative systems, they can understand that, but they still think that cages are the worst system. And they think that because they think in a cage, the animal has no chance of a good life. If it's in an outdoor system, it may be at a high risk of disease, but at least it has a chance. So it's interesting to understand people's psychology when they think about these things. And of course, it's easy to discount survey findings because it costs nothing for a respondent to say that they care, but there are other sources of information that back this up. And I'm going to take the example, I'm going to continue the example of cages for laying hens to make this point. I'm going to briefly show how production is moving away, not only from conventional battery cages, but also from enriched cages like the one shown in this picture that provide hens with perches, a little bit more space and a nesting area. And consumers are driving this shift away from all types of cage via many routes. Many consumers have actively gone out shopping and deliberately paid more for cage-free eggs for many years. They will pay up to 50% more. But just as someone may prefer to pay a slightly higher rate of road tax once a year, rather than having to pay a toll every time they go on a small road, consumers are getting tired of having to make these frequent point of sale decisions. And retailers, cafes, restaurants are benefiting from this demand by letting customers know that all products in their range are cage-free, and that removes the burden for the consumer of checking every packet. Also, concerned consumers join lobby groups and charities and lobby for influential politicians to produce legislative change. And this is an ongoing process. Can I have the next slide, please? So, bowing to scientific and consumer pressure, conventional cages for laying hens were banned in Europe in 2012, and most producers moved to the enriched cages that I showed on the previous slide. But consumers have never really accepted enriched cages, and so further shifts in production are continuing. In Europe, the proportion of hens in enriched cages in 2012 was over 60%, but now on the left-hand side, you can see that it's 50% and it's dropping. In the United Kingdom, on the top right-hand slide, if you look at the pale green line, in 2012, about half of hens were in free-range systems. Now that's 2/3. And if we look at the United States, starting from a very low base, the proportion of hens in cage-free systems has shifted from virtually nothing in 2012 to over a quarter of production. And similar trends are now being seen in other countries. Next slide, please. More embryonic signs of change and concern come from nearly all regions of the world. Messages about animal welfare can be easily shared by social media and transmit faster than most pathogens. A recent survey of 700 Chinese consumers, shown on the left, found that nearly half now report thinking about animal welfare at least some of the time when they make their purchasing decisions. Whilst in Latin America, the number of retail outlets making cage-free commitments is growing rapidly. The slide shows only those retailers that begin with the letter A. Next slide. Now, this all arises because consumers care about hens. It's not cheaper or easier or healthier to keep hens in free-range systems. It's actually more expensive. We have to counter consumer misunderstandings. Consumers sometimes are so attracted by cage-free systems that they think that they are better in all respects. And they don't like to hear that avian flu, for example, might be a lower risk in a cage. They just don't really understand it, or they don't want to hear it. So there are many trade-offs that we have to address. When we think about backyard flocks or small production systems, there's huge potential to move from point A on this trade-off graph up to point B or point C, where health and productivity are both increased together. But beyond a certain point, improving welfare yet further may start to compromise sustainability or resource efficiency. Next slide, please. So we are going to move to a world of compromises. And in the urban world, in higher income countries, the solution that is being landed upon is the development of multi-tier cage-free systems like the one shown on the left here. The production performance in these systems now virtually matches that of cage systems, but the birds are free to move. They may be at a high stocking density, but they are free to move and they can express more of their behavior needs. Consumers like these systems. They don't love them, but they like them. They don't provoke that visceral disgust that consumers feel about cages. So it's worth scanning the horizon. I've talked about hens, I've talked about egg production shifts, but now people are turning their attention to the broiler chicken and meat production. A recent survey showed that 90%, very recent, last year, 90% of European citizens are now calling for better broiler chicken welfare. They're well aware of some of the problems of leg health and the problems of restricted feeding for broiler breeder birds. How should other countries, lower and middle income countries, respond to these shifting patterns of production in higher income countries? I think that the idea is to learn from the mistakes that we have made when we have embraced all-out intensification without giving animal welfare a thought. Increasing wealth, education, and access to media means that young people globally are uniting against systems that cause animals pain or distress. Lower and middle income countries may be able to leapfrog over our past mistakes. Thank you very much for listening.